The air was thick with tension on the morning of September 16, 1398, in Coventry. The tournament ground at Gosford was a hive of activity, buzzing with knights, nobles, bishops, and curious onlookers. Tents adorned with the bright liveries of the kingdom's greatest lords stood tall, and the weapons of the warriors glinted in the morning sun. Today, 2 dukes of the realm were to settle their feud in a trial by combat. By the end of the day, one of them would likely be dead. Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, rode into the field on a magnificent white courser. His saddle was draped in blue and green velvet, embroidered with gold swans and antelopes. Bolingbroke, dressed in shining plate and mail armor, carried a long sword, a short sword, and a dagger. His shield, painted with a bright red cross, bore the arms of England and St. George. He announced to the Constable and Marshal of England that he had come to prosecute my appeal in combating Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, who is a traitor, false and recreant to God, the king, his realm, and me. He took his oaths, had his weapons checked and blessed, and was given a small portion of food and wine to sustain him during the battle. Then he pulled down his visor, signed himself with the cross, and rode to his pavilion, which was decorated with red roses. The crowd hushed as King Richard II entered the field, accompanied by his loyal Cheshire archers and men-at-arms. Richard, dressed in his usual magnificence, was a striking figure. Sir John Bushy, the king's loyal Speaker of the Commons, stepped forward and announced that no one should touch the wooden lists surrounding the tournament field on pain of having their hand chopped off. The tension was palpable. Next, Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, arrived, clad in red velvet with silver lions and mulberry trees on his horse. He took his oaths and rode to his own pavilion, which was adorned with the symbols of his house. As he passed through the barriers, he called out, "God speed the right." The moment of truth had arrived. The Duke's lances were measured, and the pavilions were quickly dismantled to clear the field. Each man mounted his horse, and the Constable and Marshal retreated. The crowd held its breath as Bolingbroke advanced toward his rival. Mowbray stood firm, waiting for the first blow. Suddenly, King Richard stood up and shouted, "Ho, ho!" The crowd was stunned. A great commotion ensued as each duke was sent back to his tent, with his lance confiscated. They sat there for 2 hours, while the king retreated into private deliberation. Finally, Sir John Bushy stepped forward and announced the king's verdict. The trial was over. There would be no combat. Instead, Richard had decided that both men were to be banished from the realm. Bolingbroke was to be exiled for 10 years, later reduced to 6, and Mowbray for life. The shock of the king's decision rippled through the crowd. Richard's theatrical absolutism, which had begun in 1397, had reached its peak. The full force of royal might, meant to protect the king's subjects, was now being used to enrich and empower the king himself. This was the beginning of a dark chapter in English history, where the rule of law and the protection of the realm were overshadowed by the whims of a tyrannical monarch. In the summer of 1397, King Richard II's rule over England was becoming more and more like a dark nightmare. He surrounded himself with a group of loyal but rough men from Cheshire, who often called him by the nickname Dicon. These men, dressed in the White Hart livery, were always by his side, and they weren't exactly known for their kindness. They committed terrible crimes like adultery and murder, and no one dared to stop them. Richard had a big, fierce greyhound by his side, a reminder of his power and the fear he wanted to instill. Richard also began to demand money from his subjects in a very unfair way. He sent out letters with his seal, asking for loans that no one could refuse. He even made people sign blank charters, which he could use to punish them whenever he wanted. This was a clear violation of the Magna Carta, the important document that protected people's rights. Richard's rule of terror was making the country restless. Nobles and commoners alike were unhappy. In March 1398, a group of yeomen in Oxfordshire threatened to kill the king and his nobles, and in Berkshire, there was a plan to ambush the king as he passed through. The king's behavior was becoming more and more erratic, and even his own courtiers were scared of him. He would sit on a throne in his chamber, watching everyone without speaking, and anyone he looked at had to bow to him. The situation got even worse when John of Gaunt, Richard's uncle, died in February 1399. Gaunt was a powerful man, and his son Henry Bolingbroke was the heir to his vast wealth and lands. Richard, fearing Bolingbroke's growing influence, decided to take away his inheritance and banish him from England forever. This move was seen as a clear act of theft, and it made Richard even more unpopular. In June 1399, Richard left for Ireland, taking many of his loyal supporters with him. This left England vulnerable, and Bolingbroke saw his chance. He gathered a small group of supporters and landed in Ravensbourne, near the Humber River, on July 4th. To everyone's surprise, people from all over England came to join him. The king's government, led by the Duke of York, tried to raise an army, but it was no use. The entire country seemed to be turning against Richard. When Richard returned to England in late July, he tried to gather an army in South Wales, but it was too late. Bolingbroke was already in control of much of the country. Richard disguised himself as a friar and fled to Conwy Castle, where he hoped to find loyal supporters, but even there people were deserting him. By early August, Bolingbroke was almost the master of England. On August 5th, the Principality of Chester, which was the heart of Richard's power, surrendered without a fight. Richard was now a prisoner. He met Bolingbroke at Flint, and they went through a formal but tense meeting. Bolingbroke told Richard that he had returned to help him rule better, and Richard, having no choice, agreed. Richard and Salisbury were given poor horses to ride, and were escorted under armed guard to Chester. The castle that once symbolized Richard's power was now his prison. The kingdom that Richard had tried to control with fear and violence was slipping away, and the stage was set for a dramatic change in England's leadership. On a gloomy September day in 1399, Sir William Beauchamp and Adam of Usk visited King Richard II, who was now a prisoner in the Tower of London. The Tower, a place that once offered safety during the Peasants' Revolt, now held the king in a state of despair. Richard had been locked away for almost 3 weeks, separated from his loyal servants and even his beloved greyhound, who had abandoned him. Richard's young wife, Isabella, was also a prisoner, though she was kept in honorable confinement at Sunning, a place in Berkshire. The king had been moved from Chester Castle under the orders of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who had taken control of the kingdom. Despite being in the Tower, Richard was not in a dungeon, but in a set of apartments. However, the atmosphere was heavy with the presence of Lancastrian spies, and Richard felt utterly alone. When Beauchamp and Usk sat down to dinner with the king, Richard began to speak gloomily. "My God, this is a strange and fickle land," he lamented, "which has destroyed and ruined so many kings, so many rulers, so many great men, and which never ceases to be riven and worn down by dissensions and strife and internecine hatreds." Richard then started to recount the sad stories of past English kings, from Edward the Confessor to Edward II, who had all faced similar fates. It was a heart-wrenching moment, as the king who once reveled in the tales of his ancestors now saw history repeating itself, with himself as the victim. Adam of Usk, moved by the king's sorrow, reflected on the drastic change in Richard's fortunes. The king, once a symbol of majesty and power, was now a shadow of his former self, surrounded by strangers and spies. Usk left the Tower, deeply troubled by the sight of the fallen king. 9 days later, on September 30th, the Lords and Commons of England gathered in Westminster Hall. The hall was grand, with a golden throne at one end, but it was empty. Richard was still in the Tower. Richard Scrope, the Archbishop of York, stood up and read a statement to the assembly. Richard, he said, had agreed to resign the crown because he was inadequate. Thomas Arundel, the Archbishop of Canterbury, then asked if the people would accept this. The Lords agreed, and the Commons shouted their assent. But was Richard's resignation genuine? It seemed more like he had no choice. According to the Tracin et Mort, a loyalist account, there was a heated argument between Bolingbroke and Richard before the assembly. Richard demanded to see his wife, and accused Bolingbroke of treating him unjustly. Bolingbroke, however, refused to release Richard from the Tower, and insisted that nothing could be done without the Parliament's approval. Richard, enraged, threw down his bonnet as a pledge to fight Bolingbroke, but it made no difference. The assembly moved quickly through a new legal process. The Bishop of St. Asaph read out 33 articles of deposition, detailing Richard's failures as a king. These included his evil rule in the 1380s, his tyrannical actions, and his breaches of the Magna Carta. After the articles were read, the Bishop of St. Asaph declared Richard deposed. Bolingbroke then rose, crossed himself and claimed the realm as his own, emphasizing his right by blood and the support of his friends. He showed the people Richard's signet and took Archbishop Arundel's hand. The Archbishop of Canterbury led Bolingbroke to the Golden Throne, where he knelt and prayed. When he opened his eyes, the Archbishops of Canterbury and York seated him on the throne. The hall erupted in cheers and applause. A new king, Henry Bolingbroke, now sat on the throne. He would be known as Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. On October 1st, 1399, Richard II was officially stripped of his crown, and within 4 months he would be dead, having starved in prison at Pontefract Castle. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled for 245 years, had come to an end. A new age of English kingship had begun. Henry IV's rise to the throne wasn't easy. When he deposed Richard II, the kingdom was thrown into confusion. Unlike Edward II, who was replaced by his heir, Richard was replaced by a nobleman, Henry, who claimed the throne through his royal blood. Henry IV was the closest male heir, but there were others with strong claims, like Edmund Mortimer. This made Henry IV's rule shaky from the start. The Wars of the Roses, which began in the mid-1400s, were partly because of this uncertainty. These wars started as political struggles, but turned into battles over who should be king. It wasn't until Henry VII, who had only a distant claim to the throne, took power that things settled down. Henry VII and his son, Henry VIII, went to great lengths to secure their rule, even by executing anyone with a hint of Plantagenet blood. Henry IV's reign brought back old ideas about kingship. It hadn't been like this since Henry II took the throne from Stephen's son in the 1150s. The Plantagenets had ruled for nearly 200 years, and the monarchy seemed stable. But with Richard's deposition, the idea that a king could be chosen or removed by the nobles became a real threat. By 1400, England was very different from the Norman times. The role of the king had changed. He was no longer just the most powerful man in the land. He was an office holder with a set of responsibilities. The king's power was balanced by a system of laws and a complex relationship with the different parts of society. The Plantagenet kings had to work with the people, not just rule over them. This meant that the king's actions and his personality still mattered a lot, but there were now institutions that checked his power. Parliaments, for example, became more important. They weren't just for the big lords and church leaders anymore. Ordinary people, like farmers and townsmen, could be elected to represent their communities. They had the right to grant taxes and to voice their concerns. This made the government more accountable. Even strong kings like Edward I and Edward III faced challenges from their parliaments. The way the country was run also changed. Local government became more organized, with professionals like judges, lawyers, and sheriffs. These people weren't just from the nobility. They came from different parts of society. This meant that more people felt they had a stake in the government. When the peasants revolted in 1381, they showed they understood their rights and expected the king to listen. The symbols of kingship also evolved. By 1400, England had 2 national saints, Saint Edward the Confessor and Saint George. Saint Edward represented the pious, holy king, while Saint George was the warrior. These saints were important in English history and were honored in places like Westminster Abbey and Windsor Castle. Saint George, in particular, became a symbol of English military strength. The Order of the Garter, created by Edward III, celebrated the ideals of chivalry and military glory. The tombs of the Plantagenet kings were also significant. The tomb of Saint Edward the Confessor at Westminster Abbey was a central place for royal burials. Richard II, who was deposed, was initially buried away from his family, but was later moved to Westminster by Henry V. This showed how the memory of kings could be manipulated to suit the needs of the current ruler. Other saints, like St. Thomas Becket, also played a role. Becket's shrine at Canterbury was a major pilgrimage site. Kings and nobles visited it to pray or give thanks. However, during the Reformation, Henry VIII destroyed the shrine, ending its role as a holy site. The Plantagenet kings were known for their military prowess. In the early days, battles were often sieges of castles and towns. But by the 1300s, pitched battles became more common. Edward I and Edward III led successful campaigns in Scotland and France. and Edward III's son, the Black Prince, became a legendary warrior. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 were major victories that boosted English morale and reputation. The image of the English archer with his longbow became a powerful symbol of English military might. These battles and the stories that grew from them, like those of the Black Prince and Richard the Lionheart, shaped English identity and pride. The legacy of the Plantagenet kings, both in government and in warfare, left a lasting impact on England. The Plantagenets left a deep and lasting mark on Britain, shaping the relationships between England and the rest of the British Isles. Before the Plantagenets, the idea of a unified Britain under English control was more legend than reality, with only the mythical King Arthur said to have ruled over Wales, Ireland, and Scotland alongside England. But from Henry II onward, the Plantagenet kings set out to turn this dream into a reality. Henry II was the first to bring Scotland under English control, partly as revenge against William the Lion for his role in the Great War of 1173. His efforts were continued by Edward I, who forced a Scottish king to pay homage and even took the sacred Scottish coronation stone from Scone Abbey to Westminster, where it stayed for 7 centuries. However, the Scots resisted English rule fiercely, and the seeds of Scottish nationalism, sown in the 13th and 14th centuries, continue to influence politics today. In Wales, the legacy of the Plantagenets is visible in the impressive castles built by Edward I in the 1280s. These fortresses, standing as silent witnesses to past conflicts, remind the people of North and West Wales of the long struggle for independence. Similarly, in Ireland, the Plantagenets' early involvement, beginning with Henry II and the papal bull Laudabiliter in 1155, set the stage for centuries of complex and often troubled relations between England and Ireland. The Plantagenets also transformed England itself. By 1400, the country looked very different from what it did when Henry II first arrived. Grand castles, palaces, and hunting lodges dotted the landscape, built by generations of Plantagenet kings and their nobles. London had grown into a bustling international trading center, and new towns and ports, like Portsmouth and Liverpool, flourished under royal patronage. The medieval period saw a golden age of cathedral building, with Gothic spires and flying buttresses becoming iconic features of the English skyline. Perhaps one of the most significant changes the Plantagenets brought was in the language. When Henry II came to England, he spoke Norman French and Latin, and English was considered a lowly language, fit only for commoners. But by the 14th century, English had gained respect. Edward III's Statute of Pleading in 1362 made English the official language of the courts and parliaments. Writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, John Gower, and William Langland elevated English to a language of poetry and scholarship, laying the foundation for its future prominence. The deposition and death of Richard II in 1399 marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, but their impact on England was profound. They had transformed a loosely governed, fragile realm into one of the most powerful and sophisticated nations of the age. The Plantagenets had not only shaped the political and cultural landscape of England, but had also left an indelible mark on the English imagination, a legacy that continues to influence the country to this day.